like to thank the members of the subcommittee for working with me and the ranking member over the past few months, offering suggestions and recommendations. Your input is appreciated. The MARC today supports the procurement of ships, airplanes, and ground and support equipment necessary for our naval warfighter. The MARC also funds essential development programs to maintain the Navy and Marine Corps as the most dominant power on the world's oceans for years to come. In all, the MARC before the members this afternoon will authorize $43 billion in Navy and Marine Corps procurement, $17 billion in Navy, Marine Corps research and development, $935 million for National Defense Sea Lift Fund, $37 billion for overseas contingency operations, and $359 million for the National Defense Sea Lift responsibilities of the Maritime Administration. I'll highlight a few of the major items contained in the Chairman's MARC. After the remarks of my teammate, the gentleman from Missouri, I'll open the floor for discussion for any amendments. The MARC authorizes $15.7 billion in the shipbuilding procurement and $380 million in the National Defense Sea Lift Fund for the construction of 9 new battle force vessels and 1 auxiliary oceanographic vessel. This includes 2 America-class LHA amphibious helicopter assault ships, 2 DDG-51 class destroyers, 2 Littoral combat ships, the first of a new class of maritime landing platform ships, a joint high-speed vessel, and finally, after years of strong support for both sides of the aisle, particularly Mr. Courtney, Mr. Forbes, Mr. Langevin, Mr. Nye, and Mr. Whitman, 2 Virginia-class submarines. The groundwork for this day began with the fiscal year 2008 authorization, when the subcommittee added funding to the budget request for the long lead procurement necessary to build 2 ships this year. I want to congratulate those members who worked so hard to make this happen. The MARC will authorize incremental funding of large surface vessels, such as aircraft carriers and amphibious assault ships, over a period of years, not to exceed 3/4 of the number of years of the planned construction of the vessel. This provision will allow for extremely large expenditures in ship construction to be more evenly spread out over the years of actual obligation of the funds, and would prevent the need for the Navy to repeatedly come back to Congress and request separate authorization for incremental funding. The MARC would clarify the intent of Congress in authorizing a multi-year procurement authority for FNA-18s due to the Navy being unable to meet the guidance of last year's Defense Authorization and Appropriation Acts. The MARC contains technical corrections that would allow the Department of Navy to proceed with a multi-year contract award in fiscal year 2010. The MARC would direct the Secretary of Defense to use the fiscal savings garnered from this procurement to procure the maximum quantity of additional FNA-18 E&F aircraft that the excess funding would enable. The MARC would change the requirements for submission for the long-range plan for the construction of naval vessels, commonly referred to the 30-year shipbuilding plan. The proposed change in requirement would link the 30-year plan to every 4-year submission of the quadrennial defense review, but would require stability in the plan during the intervening years. The proposed change would also direct that the construction schedule for aircraft carriers conform to current law, which requires maintaining 11 operational aircraft carriers, and that the schedule would be planned to minimize the procurement cost of those ships. This MARC will also convey a sense of Congress that a sea-based strategic deterrence has been essential to the national security of the United States since the first patrol of the USS George Washington, SBN 598, in 1960, and continues to this day with the 14 ships of the Ohio-class ballistic missile force. However, the MARC expresses reservations on the current structure of the program to replace the Ohio-class force. It is important for Congress to fully understand the balance the Department considered in assessing the capability of the new platform and the cost of that platform. Therefore, this MARC would authorize the budget request for this development program, but restrict obligation to no more than 50% of the authorized amount until the Secretary of Defense reports to the committee the guidance which shape the results of analysis of alternatives, the time needed to develop and deploy each alternative capability, and the rationale associated with the construction of a new class of submarines capable of carrying the current weapon, vice development of a smaller missile to fit our existing submarines. The MARC would authorize $18.5 billion for aviation programs with an additional $547 million above the budget request for an unfunded requirements in aviation programs submitted by the Chief of Naval Operations and the Commandant of the Marine Corps. The MARC would fully authorize the budget request for all Navy and Marine Corps aviation programs, a total of 206 aircraft. For aviation research and development programs, the MARC would authorize the continued development of the F-35 competitive engine without a reduction to the budget request for aircraft. The MARC reaffirms the subcommittee commitment to the alternative engine program as the best insurance against spiraling development cost and contractor responsiveness for the primary engine. Notwithstanding the recent comments of the Secretary of Defense, the alternative engine program, at worst, is investment neutral over the life cycle of the program, and at best, will save tens of millions of dollars by lowering procurement costs in a competitive environment. The MARC fully authorizes the budget request for the Marine Corps procurement and recommends an additional $126 million for unfunded requirements transmitted to the committee by the Commandant of the Marine Corps. These unfunded requirements will help protect Marine lives in combat operations. Specifically, the MARC would authorize an additional $33 million for 7 assault breacher vehicles, which are instrumental in minefield clearance, an additional $55 million for 24 M88A2 recovery vehicles, an additional $38 million to procure 221 mine roller systems, which operate in front of vehicles and trigger pressure-detonated IEDs prior to their ability to harm our troops. Finally, the MARC would support programs associated with the Maritime Administration and Department of Transportation. The MARC would authorize a total of $359 million for MARAD, including $100 million for the operational expenses at the Merchant Marine Academy, of which $31 million is for infrastructure and capital improvements, $174 million for the Maritime Security Program, $15 million to support the State Maritime Academies, $10 million to dispose of obsolete vessels, and $60 million for the Title 11 Guaranteed Loan Program. Additionally, the MARC would extend the authorization for funding of the Maritime Security Program from 2015 to 2025. I believe this MARC is a balanced authorization of programs under this subcommittee's jurisdiction, and above all, it meets the needs of our sailors and Marines as they attempt to fill the tasks our nation sets for them. We must never forget the young sailor or Marine as we contemplate our responsibilities to provide and maintain a Navy. I believe this MARC stays true to that promise. I now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, who along with our extremely competent staff of Captain Ebbs and Ms. Simler, has added significantly to the building of the MARC currently before the subcommittee. Mr. Aiken.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and just for the sake of time, I would ask that my comments be entered for the record. I won't go through reading them all, if that's all right with you.
Without objection.
And next thing I wanted to say, Mr. Chairman, I really appreciate your working with everybody in the committee. I think you put together a good MARC. The emphasis has been on red, white, and blue and not party-type things, and I appreciate that. And I think everybody's had a part of this, and that's the way it should be. And also, Janess, you just done a great job at trying to keep us out of trouble, and a fantastic staffer. We just want to not only congratulate you, but thank you for the good work that you've done. And that, with that, I'm almost ready to call a previous question, but I won't do that, Mr. Chairman.
Again, I'm sure. Thank you very much for your remarks. Thank you for your contributions to the subcommittee. We will now proceed to mark up HR 5136, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2011. The members should have before them copies of our subcommittee's MARC and directive report language. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Is there any discussion or question of the chairman's MARC? The chair will now recognize Mr. Aiken, the ranking member, for any remarks. Okay. If there's no further discussion, the chair lays before the members the text of the MARC for consideration. Without objection, the MARC is open to amendment at any point. Are there any amendments to the chairman's MARC? You are such good people. The question now occurs on the adoption of the MARC. So many as are in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The MARC is adopted. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Ortiz, for the purpose of a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the subcommittee's report the MARC favorably to the full committee.
The question is on the motion of the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Ortiz. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed say no. The ayes have it. The The quorum being present, the ayes have it, and the mark is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Without objection, members have 5 legislative days within which to submit written statements for the record. So ordered. I would also ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make the necessary conforming technical and clerical changes. Without objection. There being no further legislative business before this subcommittee, this meeting is adjourned.